So thank you to Bev, Harp, as well as our speakers on that last panel on state progress. Clearly, there are great and important strides that can be made at state and local levels. So now we have an exciting panel to wrap up the second main day of the annual meeting on something that I'm guessing is near and dear to all of our hearts, healthy food and water, with a focus on regenerative agriculture and why and how for our health and for our future, we need to shift away from industrial forms of food production toward, or rather back to, sustainable and indigenous farming practices. To kick us off, we have Senator Michael Braun, who is a lifelong resident of Jasper, Indiana, a Main Street entrepreneur, forester, and lifelong conservationist. In 2019, Senator Braun joined Senator Chris Coons from Delaware in founding the Senate Climate Solutions Caucus in order to find common ground on climate solutions that will solidify American leadership, promote opportunities for American workers, and protect our environment for generations to come. Senator Braun serves on the Senate Agriculture Committee and has been a tree farmer for the last 30 years. Senator Braun will be coming to us via recorded video today to speak about the growing Bipartisan Climate Solutions Act, co-introduced with Senator Debbie Stabenow in the Senate, which will help break down barriers to participation in carbon markets and has backing from 60 leading agricultural and environmental organizations. This legislation has passed the Senate Agriculture Committee unanimously and is on its way to the Senate for a vote. Let's hear now from Senator Braun.
Thank you to the Medical Society Consortium for Climate and Health for the opportunity to say a few words about my growing climate solutions bill at your annual meeting. As a Main Street entrepreneur and conservationist, I know firsthand that if we want to address our changing climate, then we need to facilitate real solutions that our farmers, environmentalists, industry all can support, which this bill accomplishes by breaking down barriers for farmers and forest owners interested in participating in carbon markets so they can be rewarded for climate smart practices. I'm proud that this bill has received broad bipartisan support, being co-sponsored by 47 senators, 21 Democrats, and 26 Republicans. The bill has been warmly received by those who know the topic best. Growing Climate Solutions has now been endorsed by 60 leading ag and environmental organizations. Here's how the bill works. It creates a certification program at the USDA to help solve technical entry barriers that prevent farmer and forest landowners from participating in carbon credit markets. Issues like access to reliable information about markets and access to qualified technical assistance providers and credit protocol verifiers have limited both landowner participation and the adoption of practices that help reduce the costs of developing carbon credits. The bill establishes a greenhouse gas technical assistance provider and third-party verifier certification program through which the USDA will be able to provide transparency, legitimacy, and informal endorsement of third-party verifiers and technical service providers that help private landowners generate carbon credits through a variety of ag and forestry-related practices. Most importantly for me is how much interest I've heard from farmers as I tour Indiana about this natural climate solution that's a win-win for farmers and the environment. Crafting real-world solutions like the Growing Climate Solutions Act is why I ran for the U.S. Senate, and I hope you will not hesitate to reach out to me if I can be of assistance. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak about the Growing Climate Solutions Act.
Wonderful, thank you, Colin. Clearly a highly impactful piece of legislation and just highlighting another opportunity for advocates to get involved, to talk about climate solutions as health solutions. So next on our agenda, we have Catherine Kling. And unfortunately, we had a last minute change due to a family emergency. So Catherine Kling is no longer able to join us. I will go ahead and introduce her briefly, and then I want to thank Mona Sarfaty for standing in to present her slides. So Catherine Kling, a Tisch University professor in the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management and faculty director at the Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future. She specializes in the economic valuation of ecosystem services and integrated assessment modeling for water quality modeling. Her research program received over $7 million in funding from the National Science Foundation, the USDA, the US EPA, among others, and she served for 10 years on EPA Science Advisory Board. Her presentation today will focus on agriculture and water quality in the Mississippi Watershed. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Mona, to present Catherine Kling's very well illustrated and self-explanatory slides.
Thanks so much, Kate. Okay, first slide, please. So this slide illustrates the extent of agriculture along the Mississippi watershed, and you can see that it takes up a tremendous amount of the geography of the country. The next slide. Again, this is the Mississippi watershed, which is the world's fourth largest river basin and covers 40% of the continental United States in 32 states. The region is home to 57% of US farmland and includes 80% of its corn and soybean acreage. It's home to over 350 animal species and is traversed by over 60% of migratory birds. It has some of the worst nutrient pollution in the country. That's from nitrogen and phosphorus. It has occurs some of the actually, I'm not sure what that abbreviation is. And there's a large and growing annual dead zone in the outlet at the Gulf of Mexico basin, as you can see there in red. Next slide, please. During the peak growth, this is one of the two most productive growing systems in the entire world. Next slide, please. You can see here slides that show from 2019, the corn production areas and the soybean production areas in the country. You can see that some areas have both crops and other areas have largely one crop or the other. And this totals 97 million acres of corn and 84 million acres of soybeans and 45 million acres of wheat. The graph on the left there shows the uses of the corn that's grown. And in red, you can see the portion of the corn that is grown for food purposes. The yellow is the corn that goes for fuel use, turned into alcohol, which becomes part of the fuels that we consume. And then the blue is the portion of the corn that goes to animal feed. So you can see that, you know, the great bulk of the corn that's grown is really for fuel use and for animal feed. Next slide, please. This is a slide that shows the sources of all the greenhouse gases that were going into the atmosphere from the United States in 2018. We've seen this slide before with the large percent that is accounted for by transportation, large percent accounted for by industry, commercial sources, residential, and then that 10.5% is that which comes from agriculture, which pertains to what we're talking about here. Next slide, please. The water quality issues that stem from our agricultural production are very extensive. So 46% of the region's streams are judged or were judged to be in poor condition, with another 25% judged to be in only fair condition. And this was as measured in 2008-9. And nutrient pollution is the largest single problem that is the cause of that. As for lakes, this is data from 2012. 35% of the lakes have excess nitrogen and 40% have excess phosphorus. Next slide, please. We saw earlier the slide that showed that dead zone that was right at the Gulf of Mexico, where the Mississippi River enters into the Gulf. And this dead zone is a hypoxic zone. It's a recurring dead zone. Recently, its size was over 5,800 square miles, but its average size is 5,800 square miles. And this means that this area is essentially dead for commercial and recreational fishing. And you can see over on the right side, a illustration that shows how that works with algae blooms on the surface being fed by the nutrients that come from the rivers and down the Mississippi into the Gulf. And then those algae die and decompose. And this decomposition results in low dissolved oxygen, which it makes it very difficult for fish, shellfish, and other organisms to survive. Next slide, please. So this is referred to as the Gulf of Mexico hypoxic zone. And you can see there the distribution of dissolved oxygen. And the darkest color there has very little oxygen. And so it goes from that very deep red, almost a brown, up to the yellow. And most of the area that's outlined here has very, very little oxygen. Next slide, please. Effects on people include the impact on drinking water, which encompasses the cost of cleaning the water, residual health damage, which may be caused by the polluted water. And of course, this impacts private wells. And sometimes this is responsible for toxins which come from those algae blooms. And many will remember that toxic algae bloom, which occurred back in 2014, when there were 500,000 people in Northwest Ohio that were without drinking water for a period of time because of a massive algae bloom on one of the Great Lakes. Next slide, please. So continuing on with the effects on people, we talked, of course, about the health damage, the wells, the cost of cleaning, and then there are also the impacts on recreational fishing, boating, and wildlife. And according to a 2020 report, about 13% of people in the United States actually participate in freshwater fishing activities. So this affects far more people than one might otherwise realize. There's also the impacts of direct contact with this water through recreation, swimming, wading, having pets swim in the water, paddleboarding, etc. And the CDC has reported these illnesses and symptoms that come from contact with harmful algal blooms, and it includes skin, eye, nose, and throat irritation, abdominal pain, headache, neurological symptoms, vomiting, and diarrhea. Next slide, please. There's also the impact on the local amenity that is provided by the waterways. And so there are 135 million housing units in the United States that are along those waterways, and 3.4 million are actually within 500 meters of a lake. And so this has pretty extensive effects on people who live around the waterways. Next slide, please. And then, of course, in addition to all of those issues that impact people, there's the local ecological disturbance. And so, you know, you can see in the bottom of that slide to the left, that area which is highlighted around the dead zone. And so this is an area where you have an expanded impact on the ecology of the water. Next slide, please. There is also greenhouse gas emissions that are not absorbed, either come from eutrophication in the lakes, or the lakes don't provide the natural sink value that would otherwise occur. And so instead, that water can even become sources of greenhouse gases as opposed to absorbers of greenhouse gases. And so that is another consideration when we're thinking about what is happening along this, this entire watershed area. Next slide, please. And I want to mention that Catherine Kling is actually the researcher. It was mentioned at the beginning that she's had these millions of dollars in support from the National Science Foundation, and she is the source of the original research that you saw in these slides. So very disappointed that she wasn't able to join us today, but the information is just so powerful that we felt like we really wanted to go ahead and present it. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Mona. And we have one more fantastic presenter here today. And just wanted to note too, with Catherine Kling, when we get to Q&A, if you do have any questions for her, to put those in the chat, and we will try to get those to her to see if she would be able to respond, so we can share those out with folks at the end. But I now have the honor to introduce you to James Skeet, who has been working with Native Americans for over 35 years. He has worked for many years as a cross-cultural speaker and consultant for organizations to reformulate and incorporate Native worldviews that create successful interventions and relations with Native Americans. His most recent commitment is to share his passion to heal the soil and reconnect Indigenous peoples to the land through traditional Native farming practices. His presentation today will focus on health and climate solutions from an Indigenous perspective. Please welcome James Skeet.
Thank you, Kate. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. I guess we're just going to jump right into the slides. Do you have the slides up now?
I do.
Yes, we do.
Hey, James, it's Colin.
Okay. Hey, Colin. I'm going to be talking about just basically a little bit of the results of what has happened to Indigenous people pandemic-wise. You guys have all heard that my tribe, which is the Navajo tribe, we call ourselves Dene. My name, James Skeet, is my, you might say, colonized name. But my grandfather gave me a name called Nakhe, Ashki Nakhe, which means little Mexican boy. Because I guess when I was very young, I looked like a little Mexican kid. My grandpa's name was Money Skeet. He got his name standing outside the trading post. And the Mormon missionary would ask him, you know, what do you want? And he'd always say money. Very entrepreneurial, very progressive in his thinking. And you have to understand that not all Indigenous people are the same in their worldview. The Pueblos along the Rio Grande and some of the tribes are sedentary. Some are transmigratory, and I'm a part of the bunch that is very transmigratory in their movement. So in this transmigratory movement, they establish some very interesting cosmology and relationship. And I'll explain a little bit more about the cosmology. But in terms of the health, because of commoditized foods that was introduced by the federal government as a part of the treaty system, that's when our health, hypertension, diabetes, a lot of ill health was brought to our people in a much more strategic way. Now you have to realize before the colonization or before Europeans set foot on these shores, about 90% of our people have been extinct because the diseases had progressed inland, and many of the tribes were basically remnants when many of the white people or Europeans, immigrants, started moving inland. So we have been sort of, for many generations, I think we're now in the 7th generation since contact, we are really looking at and making decisions on what are some of the pivotal changes that we need to make as Indigenous people. And in that pivotal change, how can we bring as many people along? So if you could, Colin, get the second slide. In working with healthcare systems, I work with United Healthcare and some other managed care organizations in New Mexico, help design some of the issues regarding Medicaid and how it rolls itself out, how it comes live into each of the states. New Mexico being a very colonized, almost you might call it arrested development. We export 95% of our foods and we import 95% of the foods into New Mexico. As looking from my perspective as a Navajo, we've been colonized 3 times by different groups. But this is a man in the maze. You might say I originally intended to become a very acculturated and very educated and take on health systems that are outside of my own Indigenous perspective. So you might say I went to the very edge of this labyrinth, and one day my wife and I woke up and we said, you know, we got to change. There's something different that we need to do with our lives. And this is where this pivotal moment took place 7 years ago, that we started turning towards what I call a migration back to center. And because of the pandemic, much of this is happening. A lot of dream time is happening with people because they had the opportunity to sit still for a while and really re-examine their lives. So you might say that much of our understanding or perspective is really based solely on capturing more of this kind of thought and feel, the spirituality of all of us. How do we migrate back to center? Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite poems. Just now, a rock took fright. When it saw me, it escaped by playing dead. When I read this, it reminded me of what my parents used to tell me. I didn't learn how to read until 7th grade. And in that time, not knowing how to read, there was a different literacy that was taking place. It was more of a spiritual literacy that was taking place, and that was being nurtured by my grandfather, my grandmother, my parents. And in that process, one of the really neat things that I learned was my mom used to say, the plants are reaching out to you. They are our grandparents. They are grandfathers and grandmothers, and they want to heal us. So in this discussion with epistemology, looking at science, looking at reductionism, one of the problems that we have is that people are wanting spiritual literacy. That spiritual literacy is something that what we try to demonstrate on our farm, that everything is connected. Next slide, please. This is something of a picture that came to me in one of my sweat lodges and thinking and dream time. The worldview epistemology is really a perspective. What our perspective as Indigenous people and people of color is that we have been marginalized. We've had this organic Indigenous mindset that all things are sacred. And that's what refers to the little quote prior to the slide, is that in all things being sacred, there is an ethics that establishes itself. There are core values that we end up backing up into. Francis Bacon, Descartes, all those wonderful philosophers at some point initiated this kind of mechanical industrial mindset, which moved into conventional farming. Francis Bacon used to hunt down women healers. And then Descartes, his saying is, I think, therefore I am. Set into motion this very mechanical compartmentalized, fragmented, currency-based economy and society where winners take all, where nature is to be controlled, time is linear. It's a currency-based economy. That's one of the reasons why many of the indigenous people all around the world were colonized or dominated to create this exchange of currency based on minerals. Food became a commodity, which further down the road became land being commoditized. It moved into a very chemistry based because the mechanical industrial movement slept with the imperialism and empiricism, reductionist thinking. It's always gone hand in hand. Now we've got pharmaceuticals that are taking over our universities, and it's really just a synthetic way of looking at the world. Production is heavy, a lot of substantial inputs needed on farms, whether it be equipment or substantial inputs from the government. Tremendous amount of dense disturbance, deep plowing. All of those are some things that the former the presenter before me was referring to. It's really this mindset, this lens. So the indigenous mindset are all things are sacred, nature to be respected and copied, that time is secular, that economy or health is regenerative, that we start from zero and then we move up. Food is medicine, which the microbes create this medicine and then the plants uptake. So you might say the plant to some degree, or things that are growing, is really the mouth of the earth, so to speak. It's biological, secular base, which I call biocosmology, cosmology referring to indigenous ceremonies and understanding that refers back into how we conduct ourselves here on the surface of the earth, that we are the two-legged, the most vulnerable, and yet the four-legged can take care of themselves and live on without us. And it refers to low inputs, minimal disturbance. It's kind of like a pendulum going back and forth through time and space. But what's happening is that in terms of systems, folks are referring to resilience, going back to normal, sustainability. I really feel those words are to continue to prop up the mechanical mindset system. What we need is a transformative adaptation, meaning that indigenous people have always adapted to whatever conditions environmentally or in their culture, and they moved away from it or did something with it to transform it. Now, resilience and sustainability to a large degree should be our trajectory. It should be the things that we're going to be discussing or talking about in terms of the future, not the past. It's like I have a farm here, and it's like I beat my pigs and I want them to become resilient. It's like putting indigenous people on reservations. We want them to be resilient and sustain themselves within the context of this worldview that's been very destructive. So these are some things that I have to really look at. But let's look at Mother Nature. Next slide. Mother Nature has already figured this out. The predator has a pupil that's round. It targets something, whereas the herbivore, the sheep, it has a horizontal perspective. So indigenous people have always had this, especially migratory indigenous people have always had this horizontal view, whereas colonization has always had, what am I going to extract? What am I going to take away? Next slide, please. You've probably seen this picture of Custer and Sitting Bull. Custer was trying to run for presidency, and it's because of the European banks that was pushing the United States government that was probably about 100 years old by the time. And the collision of these two nations is really interesting because when he was going into battle at Little Bighorn in Montana, southern Montana, what was going on was that the soldiers had just gotten paid, currency-based economy, really no place to spend it, and they moved into and confronted with the Northern Cheyenne, the Dakotas, some Arapahoes were there, Shoshones, collided with Sitting Bull. And if you notice, Sitting Bull he always carried his peace pipe around, which is sort of the connection to that spiritual reality. So he was looking from those lenses, whereas Custer was looking how to get more miners into the Black Hills and to extract the economy. That was one of the reasons why the Navajos were defeated. Next slide, please. I'm going to end with this because I think there's a lot to talk about, and I want to make sure that these pieces that we just mentioned are very important to climate solutions and health solutions. If you look on the right, what's missing is this microbial sponge on the face of the earth, which has to do with soil, which has to do with the charges within the microbes. It's a biological view. And this biological view really helps the biotic pump up in the atmosphere. And then it creates this convection. On the left is the desertification that's going on, the compaction, which in New Mexico we're dealing with in such large degree. Much of the migration all over the world is a part of that desertification that's taking place. It's a consistent heat. We end up burning a lot of our seeds in the ground because it's so hot. So in looking at these two dichotomies, if we don't create the diversity in the root system, the exudates, if we don't create the medicine in that biological draw up from the plants to people, we're going to have a lot of ill health, which is what's happening. And if we spray things with Roundup, glyphosate, what we're doing is we're creating a lot of microbiome disruption in our gut. And so the things that affect us is really a part of how we've looked at not only our worldview, but as a result of having a currency-based economy that is really into extractive economy, which refers to the colonization that has happened all over the world. We're having to speak to this now, and many indigenous people all along from the Bering Straits down to Central America, prophets that are saying, hey, listen, one day the white man will come back to us and want to hear the voice of our indigenous people. So with that in mind, I am going to stop here and give an opportunity for the folks to manage and this session. And I want to thank you for the opportunity. We have a lot of stuff on our website, covenantpathways.org. If you're interested in learning more, we're working with a lot of medical doctors and looking at why Native Americans were so hampered by COVID-19. And I'm sure there's going to be more viruses coming through, and we have to change the way what lenses we look through. We can't just sterilize everything because we not only killed the bad microbes, we also kill the good microbes. We have to learn to help people get the nutrient-dense foods in their systems so that they can fight off a lot of these viruses. So that's my take on how that can be a solution to not only health, but a solution to our earth, because right now, Mother Nature's in balance, and we're going to see more of her wrath upon our lands, whether it be fires, flooding, whatever it may be. It's trying to get back into balance. But because we call ourselves Homo sapiens, which means wise human, we have now become mega sapiens, which is big humans making big imprints on our ecology. So we can change. We can change, and we need to start now, because this train is out of control. It's got no pilot, and it's moving fast to our destruction, our sterilization of our human race, and also the destruction of all our land. So we really need to listen to what our indigenous, because we are an elder culture, meaning that the immigrants are a younger culture. So this elder culture needs to speak and step forward and begin to share the wisdom and knowledge of how to keep the earth in balance. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James, for that great presentation and perspective. And if you have time to stay on the phone, we do have some time for a few questions. If
Sure,
anyone
yes,
wants
yes.
to use the chat to put those in, and I can read those out. So it looks like we have a question from Maya for both Catherine and James. We clearly need a significant shift in how and what we farm and subsidize. And I am wondering how we can combine and center the Indigenous perspective with new technologies such as slow release fertilizers that result in less nitrogen runoff than the newer. Do you have thoughts on that, James?
Yes, I definitely do. One of the things that we have to realize is that if we mimic or pattern after Mother Nature, these are successions we're looking at. The need for pesticides or herbicides or whatever you might call it, sides, the word sides means death. These are different successions. What we're finding in our area is that we get a lot of what they call Russian thistle, which is like a tumbleweed. And when we started looking at the nutrient density, we found that the first succession of weeds were the most nutrient. And these are the perennials that many of our indigenous people ate as a part of their hunter-gatherer. We're looking at a very narrow perspective, narrow lens that silos itself because of science, because of reductionism. We have to pattern things after Mother Nature. Mother Nature has a way of moving a lot of these things out of the way. These synthetic values that we bring, inputs that we bring into the way we farm, just started in the 40s and 50s, and it's not always been. And the deep plowing started with the sod busters. You know, the Europeans that came in thinking that that was a way to cultivate the land. At one point, it is said historically that a squirrel could jump from tree to tree all the way across from the east to California. A lot of the lungs of the U.S. is gone now. So part of the thing that we are missing is this wisdom and knowledge, even the biochar and the charring. The Aborigines at some point in Australia, I was talking to the soil scientist, Christina Jones, and I was telling her a little bit about the last remnants of the megafauna, the buffaloes, how they came in and created this symbiotic relationship with the land. And she said, James, we didn't have the grasses like you guys did. He said we had herbs, and the Aborigines knew how to use it. But because of the colonization and the extractive ways in which we have done things, we have really removed a lot of that knowledge and just have dominated to where it no longer exists, or it's existing, but it's very rare and hard to find. Hope that answers the question.
Wonderful, thank you. And one more question, if there was one thing that you would have attendees take away, an action item, something attendees on this call can do moving forward to advance climate and health solutions from this Indigenous perspective and mindset, what would that be?
It would be the biology, incorporating more of the biology and balancing out the chemistry approach. The biology, which I call cosmology, are ceremonies that help us, shadow cast. Shadow casting is like every object has a shadow. And that shadow to Indigenous people is the world here, the physical world. The real object that's casting that shadow is the spirituality. So part of the things that we really need to get back to is searching out our essence. What is the essence, not just with immigrants, but with Indigenous people? How do we become reattached to the land? and not see land as commodity or not see food as commodity, but to really begin to look at local microbiomes, things that work, the kind of relationship that we can have. So it's a circular economy, and part of the word indigeneity or indigenous is really using local entities into your system so that you don't flatten things out. You're just not about extracting from your farm, but your farm is working so it has this, you're using the manure going back into the biomass and the feed, and then it's kind of a circular motion. So you decolonize yourself and re-indigenize your farm. So those are some things that we're doing. And it's really just that mindset of looking at the biology and incorporating that into a lot of the nutrition, how we look at health, relating it to not just, more pharmaceuticals, injections, synthetic injections of drugs, but looking at what does nature do in order for us to heal. And that's probably the question that I would put in front of the healers, is that we are becoming more and more siloed and reductionist in our thinking, that we can't even see an aerial view of where this earth is headed. So I guess just sticking our heads a little bit higher and looking at a much broader view would be something that will help us begin to understand how we can make inroads into this transformation. We need to adapt. We need to work together. And part of the soil is the diversity. If you create the diversity, then when you go up in their cosmology, the different layers, no wonder we're very polarized in this country, Democrat or Republican, because we're monocropping. We're either doing just corn or soybean. Nature doesn't do that. That's artificial. So really looking at things and breaking that down to where we create the diversity in the soil and how we live and how we create the culture up on top.